So my name's Pauline Greenidge, and I am a consultant, an author, an instructor, and based locally here in Calgary. My background is primarily in human resources and has been for the last over 20 years. I was born and raised in Calgary. And for some of you that joined the conversation earlier, we were talking about Southern Alberta and my time spent there as a youth. And part of that experience is something that fundamentally forms what I like to do, working with small to medium sized clients, and that is really helping them come up with good people solutions, but also sharing that mindset of invitation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But in addition to the work with clients, like I said, I do some instruction at UFC, and I met Steve. Gosh, 4 years ago, Steve, maybe longer.
Yeah,
I
I would
don't
say
know.
at least. Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah. And so we've always had a great rapport. And so this is a great opportunity for us to connect. So welcome everyone, and I'm looking forward to our convo.
Nice. Thanks, Pauline. Sorry, Colleen. So I'm Steve. A lot of you, I think, either know me or are aware of me through work. Some of us have a longer and a bigger history than others. But my background, just a quick overview, is I live here in Calgary now. I've been here for a long time, almost 18, 19 years, if you can believe it. And my background is a bit more checkered than Pauline. As I mentioned, she's a lot nicer person than me. I had an Army career. I basically left high school at a certain point because my teacher told me if I wasn't going to do anything, don't do it here. I spent 22 years in the Canadian Army and then retired in '98 as a sergeant major. And then I also spent a few years up north working in a remote community named Norman Wells for a few years. And then I joined Red Cross and spent my 12, 13 years there starting out in the disaster management business, and then as a leader of as the Alberta divisions as operations here in Alberta, Northwest Territories. And then the last 7 or 8 years, I've been scratching out a living as a consultant and a speaker and a coach, and had a pretty good time doing it, and even made a little bit of money here and along the way. So, so that's my story, and this is where we're at today. There's somebody. I'm just trying to keep up with people coming in. So this conversation had started with Pauline back, I guess, maybe in June or July, I guess, maybe earlier in the summer. And I was watching some of the things happening in the world around Black Lives Matter and the missing and murdered women, and here in Canada, and the horrible situation with the residential schools and mass graves. And I wasn't sure what could be done, and what needed to be done, or what people wanted for help in this. And so I just had this internal conversation, and then one day I reached out to Pauline and I said, would you be interested in having a conversation with leaders about leadership around race, and how do we have this conversation in workplace, and how do we make it safe? And part of my story, some of you will be aware because I just wrote about it in an article. And John McCain has a tremendous saying that resonates a lot with me. I guess maybe it's because I'm getting old, or I am old and getting older, is that he often said that you can live with pain and you can live with embarrassment, but remorse is a terrible, awful companion. And when I say, there's lots of things in my life, as all of us, we wish we had little do-overs, but there's this one thing that has resonated in my mind a lot, actually, and it comes from some of my other work with other organizations particularly around First Nations and Aboriginal work, and building safe places for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And it was a story that happened in Florida, to be honest. We were there on a big training exercise when I was in the Army, and I was an acting sergeant major, so I was pretty senior. and we had a group of soldiers attached to us from another organization. And one of the young guys, I think he was a private, may have been a corporal, doesn't matter, but he was, he was a soldier, and he deserved better than what he got. And I overheard his section commander, a master corporal, uh, refer to him face to face, which I guess surprised me, as a Tundra N-word. A couple of times, actually. And to my enduring shame and regret and remorse, I did not address it at the time. And it's come up a couple of times in different conversations in the last little while. And that whole incident just has really got to bother me a lot, because that young guy, for all sorts of reasons, he was a private, and he did not deserve what he got. And he deserved, but more importantly, he deserved protection. And I didn't do that. I should have done something a lot different. There's a lot of million things I could have, should have done. I had the authority, the power, and the position to make a change, but I didn't do it. And I often think about that, about why I didn't. I have some thoughts on that. And it's around moral courage, where we're in a situation that we're unsure of our environment, because in the position I was in, I was an acting leader in the role as an acting person. I didn't have permanency in that. I was sort of in a mixed group of people outside of my normal team. And these other guys were from another unit. And it's not an excuse, and I'm certainly not trying to make it an excuse, but I think that put me in a position where I wasn't sure what to do. And instead of having a little bit of courage, I didn't do anything, to my shame. And that sort of led to our conversation today too. So I know Pauline, we've talked about this and we've thought about it a little bit, and so I'm going to ask Pauline to kind of grill me a little bit in a nice safe way. That's okay. And I don't even know, I'm not even 100% sure what she's going to ask about, but I just want to start the conversation with that admission and, I guess, confession, I suppose, and see where we go from there. You're on mute, Pauline. Sorry.
I always think I'm going to remember to unmute myself. Thank you for that, Steve. And, I think, first of all, the courage you're sharing, showing now to share the story is something that's important. That to have that recognition as a starting place, that there was an opportunity, and perhaps a missed one. But the question that I would ask you, to start with, Steve, is in that moment when you were seeing that young soldier, and certainly a private, if I'm correct, is sort of an entry, right? It's a lower ranking position.
Bottom of the food chain.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So when you saw that, what was your very first reaction when you saw what was happening? And then tell me a little bit about the next thought that you had. So your first reaction, then your next reaction.
My first reaction was, I guess, did I hear that right? Did I actually hear somebody say such a thing, like out loud in public to another human being, and especially somebody much lower down in the rank chain of command? And I guess I kind of questioned myself if I actually heard what I thought I heard. But in my heart, I guess, Pauline, I actually knew that I heard it too. Like I was trying to, I don't know, justify it, rationalize it, make it go away. And maybe part of me was like, well, what the hell do I do with this? Like, what could I, should I, what's right? I know, in retrospect, I know exactly what was right to do, but in the time,
Yeah.
I got tripped up.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that, Steve, is because that's a human reaction. And it doesn't really actually matter, folks, what side of the situation you may be on. One of our first reactions is disbelief, if it's blatant. Sometimes it's not as blatant as the example that you shared, Steve, where it's somebody using a very derogatory or racist term out loud. Oftentimes it's a lot more subtle, but that first reaction of going, did I hear what I just heard is a common one. And you may have in your own experience seen that or been on the receiving end of it. And then the second piece was your reaction after that. Once you kind of went, oh, did I just hear that? Yes, I did. What was the next piece for you? What went through your mind?
Well, to be honest, in my mind was, I guess I was debating in my head, which was, should I do something? Um, or what to do, maybe more than should.
Yeah.
And the moment passed, and these guys kind of moved on outside of my sort of range of sight, and I didn't do it. And that's the part that's bothered me ever since, is that I could have went back afterwards. I could have went to their leadership chain. I could have done a lot of things, but I just set it aside. And yeah,
And so you've had some time to reflect on it.
30 years.
Right. And, and keep in mind, things are, our awareness and our sort of connection to some of these pieces is different than it was 30 years
Mm.
ago. Um, as you've reflected on it, what do you think were the reasons why you didn't act in the moment?
Well, I think I touched on them a little bit earlier. I was not 100% secure or assured in the position I had, because I was holding like an acting position, which gave me basically all of the power and rights and authority of a sergeant major while employed as one, but it was still an acting role. I think if they actually had been working for me, I probably would have had a different response, a quicker, more assured response. But they were from another unit that were attached to us, kind of almost temporarily for a day or two. Um, And yeah, and maybe it's not politically correct, but I just didn't pull my big boy pants up either. I just wasn't sure what to do.
Yeah. And I think sometimes a lot of it is we aren't sure what to do, right? We get that
Mhm.
sort of amygdala brain freeze. Amygdala is that little gland in your brain. It's like an almond shape, and it's our fright or flight um, responder, right? And
Right.
so when we're shocked by something, we have to decide: will we fight or did I say that right? Fight
Yeah.
or flight?
Yeah. Yeah.
And each of you may have been in that situation where you're thinking, okay, I heard something. What do I do? Right. And so in your case, it was flight, right? And we may have a fear about stepping into a situation.
Yeah.
And it's easy to make it go away because the moment evaporates pretty quickly, right? Or it
Yeah.
doesn't.
Oh, it was a busy, high intensity time too. Like I had 130 other people to look after that day, and yeah. So it was, at that moment had passed, and but it never passed in my mind, in my memory. Right? It's obviously this is of a whole series of highlights from my time in the army. This is the one that comes up in my mind, of that little voice in the back of your head that resonates at 3 in the morning of, "Oh, geez, I wish I had done something different that day." Because I think of that kid all the time. Like, what happened to him? He needed protection, and I didn't give it to him. And so what became of him? And so,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah. So,
And so,
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, you go ahead, Steve.
Well, no, I was just thinking, if you were in that situation, you're a person, obviously a person of color, bright and smart. What would you have liked to have seen or felt, if you were in that situation? And no, first off, I can't even imagine what it felt like
Yeah.
not to reach out and protect you in that situation.
Yeah. Well, what I might do here, Steve, is segue to example that I wanted to share today because I think it's a bit it's illustrative in a different way. Um, so I was a young HR professional working in a large oil and gas organization, and this is about I don't know about 15 years ago, and sort of new to this role. And it was a job I was excited about, loved the people. And I was given an assignment to help with some succession planning with the senior leadership team. And so it was on a main meeting floor. we had a big set of boardrooms down there. And I hadn't actually necessarily met all of the leadership team that was there, but they would come from across Canada and elsewhere, along with the vice president of this group. And we were going to spend a morning planning the future leaders for that organization. So I'm all ready. I've got my charts and my, drive, and I'm ready to organize and make sure we hit all of our objectives. And, I was at that time not a junior HR person, but younger in my career. So I walk into the room, and one of the leaders who had come from, oh my goodness, the province of Ontario.
Oh my gosh.
But he was there, and he says, oh, I said, is this the group for such and such, our succession plan? He goes, well, yeah, this is the group, but you're in the wrong room. And I said, oh, well, I think it's this room, and I think this is the group, and this is what we're doing, right? And he said, yeah, but you're in the wrong room. And then and I proceeded to check again. And then I had that moment that Steve just shared, where it was like, okay, is he asking because he really thinks I'm in the wrong room? Or is he thinking I couldn't possibly be the person to help lead this senior leadership team through an important workforce planning exercise in succession? And, it's interesting because by the second time and then the third time, because there was 3 times this individual asked me, there were other people looking and kind of going, because, people are busy getting ready for this exercise. And a couple of people looked up and they were looking and they didn't really say anything. And one fellow from the UK says, oh, I think you're in the right room. Come on in. Right. And so I thought, okay, so I was a little bit rattled by that, not because I didn't know what I was doing, although it was a new group. It was that I was thinking, well, why is he asking me that? Okay, so clearly he doesn't think I'm the person. So then I kind of got a little hot under my collar, and I was a sergeant in that room, and we got through the succession planning, right? Because that's how I responded. I say, okay, well, if you're going to doubt me, I'm going to show you I'm more than capable to deliver this. And it was a tough morning for other reasons. But in that moment, no one said anything, right? Other than, okay, well, yeah, come on in, right? It was after that session was done that a leader in the room, came to me and said, what I saw this morning, I didn't think that was right. I didn't like how that person treated you. But it was after the fact. And I was appreciative that someone did come to me, and then they raised it to my leader and eventually to the VP of the HR group. And so it was addressed after the fact. I never complained. I never said anything to people, but someone came to me, right? And so when you're in that situation, especially if you're the junior person, which I was, and keep in mind, I was a support as HR, I wasn't in the actual group. What came out of that, you feel yourself, you're junior to other people in the room. Other people actually have position authority. And you start to go, okay, well, I have to show now that I'm the person. That private may have said, well, this guy is going to ride me the whole time, so I have to make a decision. And I think that's one thing I would want to extract out of the example I just shared, is that when you are the recipient of something like that, and it can be overt, it can be more subtle, like in my case, where it was more of an invalidation. You couldn't possibly be here. Or someone saying, you know what, Pauline, you're so smart, right? Well, I think I am too, right?
Yeah, of course.
It could be a compliment. And I always try and think of it that way. But younger in my career, it could have been youth, could have been anything. But oftentimes it was because there wasn't another example of someone who looked like me, who would lead such an important piece of work. And so you have to make a decision when it's happening to you. That same recognition that Steve had, is what I'm hearing actually what I'm hearing? A. And then B, what do I want to do about it?
Yeah.
Right? Do I want to say something in the moment? What's the risk to me? Keep in mind, Steve, I was new in that role, probably less than a month into that company in that job. And it was a job that I really liked, and I really wanted to be in that organization. Right. And so it wasn't that I was going to shuffle it away, but before I thought about even saying something, someone had come to me. And that really told me a lot about that organization. Someone in that room said, even though it wasn't in the moment, they came after and said, I saw something that wasn't right. And by the way, I've raised it to somebody else.
Oh,
I didn't
interesting.
even, right.
Yeah.
And so, that's one thing that I would, whether you're a young person or not, doesn't matter, because it tends to be in a corporate setting far more subtle, or it could be some form. We all have unintended or subconscious
Yeah.
bias. We've all heard of that term, right?
Yeah.
We're not intentionally doing something, but we might make a misstep, or we might say something and go, oh, okay, that could have sounded not great, right? um, but oftentimes it can be less overt, like in your example.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. And you just made me recall another incident when I was with uh, Red Cross, and we had a First Nations guy working for us, and he was a poor performer, like he was a bully. There's lots going on there, and somebody, a senior person, said, "Well, he knows that nobody's going to talk to him because he's First Nation. Nobody's going to challenge him on his behavior." And I said, "Well, first off, you picked the wrong guy for to say that to." And but I was very comfortable in approaching him, but it was all very fact-based and very professional, and it was evidence-based. Like, you did this, this, and this, right? And felt very comfortable addressing that situation, but not challenging him on basis of race or color or whatever, gender. And but I've heard you tell the story sometimes about, saying, "Oh, Pauline, it's kind of like, I can't believe you're so smart."
Yeah, there's lots of what, and we use that term, and it
Yeah.
sounds, at first, when I first heard the term microaggression, I was like, what is that? Like, is that a sort of a PC? Like, what is that? But it actually describes often what happens in our interactions and
Yeah.
with other people. I worked for a cooperative for years, and the chairman of the board would come every month, and he had met me, and he said, "Oh, I can't remember your name, but I should have, because of color of your skin." And he just said it out loud. And I was just like, okay, and I just thought, this is interesting. That's how people see. They're not seeing what I do, they're seeing how I look.
Right.
And so, the point of sharing these examples is just because the subtlety. We're often looking for, you know, Steve, we're not talking about protests and larger issues around BIPOC community today. It's really in our day-to-day interactions, and
Mhm.
I'd love to hear questions from
Yeah.
you guys. When you are faced with this, or you might not be faced with it yourself, but you're observing it. um, it can be subtle, and it's today, walking away. We'd love for you to walk away with just a couple of key things that can help you if you're either seeing someone experience it, or
Mm.
witness it, or maybe, if it applies to you directly. Because it can happen with race, it happens with gender, it happens with all kinds of things, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'd encourage people just to, it's not, we don't have that big a group, but I would just, if you want to have a question or make a comment, just go in the chat box and I'll call you by name. And also, we do have, Pauline and I put together a 2-pager that we're going to send out to all the participants along with the recording. Just kind of some tips, I guess, to have the conversation. But I might ask Pauline, and I know, maybe a microaggression would be to ask you to speak for all people of color.
yeah.
So I don't want to go down that road too far, but I'm thinking about some of the things that have happened in the past, year or two around, Black Lives Matter protests, or even, the things around murder and miss. How should a leader support somebody in the workplace when all of this is going on around them, right? Like, maybe even on the street in front of your building.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think you could invite your team to have a conversation about it. But I always say guiding principles are context and purpose, right?
Right.
So the context is, if you have that type of conversational relationship with your teams, and it's a bit different because it's distributed. So we could be all at home and hearing about it,
Yeah.
right? So, but if we are in the building and we are seeing it, you say, you know what, there's a lot of activity. Is it worthwhile us having a conversation about it? And understanding, if you're going to open that up, to what's the purpose, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And is it because we're not entitled to ensure everybody has the same view, right? And there's a piece around being respectful,
Yeah.
um, being respectful of other people's view, but also if you're sensing in your organization that it's important to have that outlet, particularly if you have different generations at work, I think that's useful. That's what I
Yeah.
would say.
Sure.
The other thing is more so that, those pieces are about social justice, but more on the subtlety side, microaggressions. It's a good place that you could segue into. Well, here's actually in our workplace. Let's just, we're not accusing or talking about anybody specific,
Yeah.
but microaggressions can look like something very, very visceral, like what you talked about, an example of seeing somebody go through that. But it could also be invalidating somebody. Oh, where are you from? We opened
Yes.
up our conversation today to say, hey, where are you from? When I was growing up, I got asked that all the time. And then I noticed my friends didn't get asked that. My Scottish friend who came here at 7 didn't get asked that, but I got asked that, the person born and raised here. And it was just because people didn't have
Interesting.
a sense of familiarity. And
Yeah.
so what they were really wanting to know, not where I was from, they wanted to know my background and ancestry. And you have to say, well, why is that? Right? If I say I'm from Calgary, so I started answering like I'm from 45th Street, which actually is true
Yeah.
for you Calgary
Yeah.
people. But my parents were from Barbados, and that's what they wanted to understand, right?
Mm.
So that could be sort of an invalidation. If I tell you I grew up on south side of Edmonton or I'm from 45th Street, that's good. Where
That
did
should
you
be
grow up?
enough, right?
Right? And so it's a borderline of curiosity versus um, an invalidation. So back
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
microaggression. If someone says that's where they're from, believe them. Um, and then there's sort of the micro sort of insult. Oh, welcome. Welcome to our group. Gosh, we haven't had many people from your community in our company
Uh,
before. That, you know, what is the purpose of that comment, right?
yeah. Oh, yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
As
Eh,
for a leader, it's always when I've led teams. Sorry, and then I'll turn it over to you,
Yeah,
Steve.
for sure. No problem.
And to the group. It's always about what work are we here to do. I found that to be the great equalizer. What is the work that we're here to do? What is the purpose of what we're doing, and letting people do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And building relationships. And curiosity does build relationships, but it needs to be done in a way that's in service of each other, but also the work.
Yeah. I got two things, and then I think I saw Alan made a comment there, so maybe we'll call on him in a minute. But I got two thoughts from that. One is, I grew up in farm country in Southern Ontario, and then I joined the army, and we would forgive a lot of sins if the person was a good farmer or a good soldier. People set a lot of things aside, like horrible things, to be perfectly honest, about what they did at home or how they treated their family or their spouse or whatever it was. But he's a good soldier, they would say, right? And I think as leaders, we just have to check that bias too. Like just because somebody's good at their job, but they're a terrible human being, doesn't mean you should have them around. You need to figure out how to manage that. And the other thing you mentioned about, bringing people together to have a conversation about what they're seeing, what's going on the street, or microaggressions in the office. My advice would be that, or my first instinct for a lot of people, or a lot of people's first instinct would be to bring in some consultants and bring in some diversity training and something along that lines. And that might be part of the solution. But I would tell anybody who I was coaching or working with in that environment that as the leader, it's your responsibility to get off your ass and start the conversation yourself. Because if you pass the buck to consultants, and I know Pauline and I are both consultants, so I'm not trying to turn down any work here, but I think it's important that you, as a leader, you have the responsibility to set the tone and have that start the conversation. Now, if you need other educational or technical or whatever support, I think that's more than fair to bring people in. But your first instinct or your first action should not to be bring in somebody from the outside. It's address it yourself and then figure out the supports you need around that.
Yeah. And sometimes that's hard,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes
Oh, my terrible.
it's not
Yeah.
easy. And so I'd be curious to hear from the group.
Mhm.
Um, are there questions or things that you have that where you felt uncomfortable or what's held you back? And it's just an honest sharing, because I think the more we recognize, um, some of my friends, for example, my white friends will say, I have a friend, he's like, I'm a middle-aged white guy, I'm the problem everywhere. And I said, no, you're not the problem everywhere, right? But just even having the conversation about it in a way
Mm.
that is honest and in a spirit of curiosity and being supportive and positive, right? Because I don't
Yeah.
think people intentionally say, you know what, this is who I am and this is how I'm going to be, in a bad way.
Yeah.
Although there are people who have their own beliefs. So I'm curious to hear, are there things, specific questions or things that you've struggled with from your end?
Yeah,
And
please do
what
jump
what
in.
what suggestions can we can provide for you? Yeah. So I'm just checking the chat, Steve. So questions come in. What are some suggestions for a faith-based, mostly white
Oh
organization
my
undergoing a
gosh.
focused change to become more inclusive? Wow.
Wow. We're going to extend this till next Tuesday, and that's a big one.
Wow. Well, I think,
So,
you know,
sorry, before you go ahead,
yeah.
Pauline, Jocelyn, could you explain, could you unmute yourself and maybe just speak to the change? You said a focused change.
Change. Yeah.
You become more exclusive. Like, what does that, I guess the question I would have is, what does that mean? Like, what are you trying to achieve with that change? If you could sum it up in a couple of sentences. I know it's a big subject.
Sum it up briefly.
Yeah.
It's a faith group who is mostly old and white
Yeah.
and wants to become more inclusive. Because to be honest and to be absolutely truthful, it will cease to exist at some point because we're all going to die soon at some point.
Yes.
And the young people are so fed up with us. And I can understand that. For instance, there's a lot of work going on right now across Canada for this particular group, and it is exciting to me. My husband's from Ghana. I've been doing this work with my own built-in anti-racism trainers since I married him, and it's not easy and it's hard, but it is something that we both stuck together with,
Mm.
and it is doable. You can change, you can learn. So, but most people don't have that opportunity.
Sure. I think if you're okay, Joss,
Yeah.
Pauline, I might jump in. There was I heard, not if you're, I'd have to think about where I just heard. Do you know of a lady by the name of Krista Tippett?
No.
She's in the States and she broadcasts mostly on NPR. She has a podcast called Beyond Me, Being or Beyond Being. And interestingly enough, she just had a conversation about a Baptist minister and Muslim Iman. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. Iman, and they hold these training education things, and they've actually joined with a rabbi, but bringing in the three face of the leadership, like the leaders of the various churches, temples, and congregations to come together. And the reason it just resonated when you said that is like they get people together and just start having gentle conversations, not forcing it by bringing in maybe in your situation, like let's bring in a pastor of color and start speaking, right? It's like, let's bring in some people and let's have coffee and lunch and start talking. And a friend of mine always said, if you go to a room and there's full of people you don't know, you'd rather sit with somebody you don't like before you sit with somebody you don't know. And I think it's how do you have that place where invite a church or a faith-based group that's mostly of people of color, and not to a sermon but to a lunch. I don't know, Pauline.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on. One is the view of faith in today's society, right? And so you see this with a number of churches where there's older denominations, and they're saying, how do we get young people or younger people, families, diverse groups to attend? And I think there's community outreach, but there's also what's the messaging, right? And in a faith-based organization, the message is built in. It's your faith, it's your values, and so sharing that in a way that's meaningful. My mom used to go to a church when she lived in Surrey, BC, that had congregations that used the same facility. And every so often they would have people from different congregations, like the Korean congregation and then another one. And they would, the pastors would come and share messaging and invite others and, bring a friend. So you didn't feel like you're on your own. Right. And so it's an, because you have that unifying piece in faith, that's one thing that you can pull off from a values perspective. But then the other piece is, what are younger families and people who of different generations looking for in their faith practice, right? What is it that is they're needing? Is it something that they need in those diverse communities? Could it be language skills? Could it be, job search skills through my faith-based community? Something that is going to bring value to their life from a faith-based perspective. And you will start to see that many of our most talented young folks are people of color, as well as everybody else. This is not to the exclusion of everybody else, but those would be some initial thoughts, because there's two things at play there: your age of congregation, but also who is Canada today? I mean, we just elected two mayors of large cities here in Alberta, people of color, and both coming from an immigration situation, one far long ago and one more recent. But people are not so concerned about what you look like. They're saying, what can you do? Right? Yeah. I hope that answers. It's a bit long-winded.
I'm sorry to hijack and pull it into a faith-based. From a work perspective, I as I was going through my career as a geologist, I did say to my boss, as you told a racist joke, that was a racist joke.
Yeah.
And the result was I did not get my bonus, and he told me that in my review that I should have just said nothing. And I disagreed with him and said, no, I will tell you when you're being racist, and you need to do something with that.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that.
Not just not give me my bonus.
Yeah.
Being courageous, that decision point we talked about when Steve had that situation, or I had that situation on the receiving end, there's a decision point to make, and you'll see in the information we'll send out to you after this about affirming the person if you're witnessing it, or if you're hearing something like, back to the microaggressions. The third category is the micro assault, where I'm going to tell that bad joke. I know it's off color or it's bad, but I don't really mean it, because I don't actually think that way, but I think the joke is funny, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of, those two things aren't congruent with each other on some level, right? But being courageous and affirming people, right? Affirming and taking an action, and it is hard, but that's how we do it. Somebody in that room, in my example, they didn't do it in the moment, but they said that wasn't right, and they came directly to me. They could have said nothing.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in? If you can unmute yourself if you like, or if you want to just type in the text box. But I think about what you mentioned there, Jocelyn, too. Like I'm of a certain age and generation, and I grew up as a child of the 60s, and I remember Canada, we export smugness here in Canada, but we're not without our faults. And I remember, as a kid, and the reason I say that is, to this day, there's this little voice sometimes in the back of my head that says, when I see someone of color or a different visible faith, there's this little thing, awful little voice that rattles around my head that was, I don't know if it was acceptable, but it was common language in the 60s and maybe even 70s. But I also know there's another little voice that says, shut up, get back, and shut up and sit in the corner, because that's old news. So I think what we have to do is not beat ourselves up for those sort of things, those biases and that we have developed over the years, but we also need to understand that it's not like the joke, the off-color joke. the inappropriate story, or even an idiom that might be based in very racist and horrible backgrounds. We need to understand why that is offensive to people. Like, I don't think I ever said it, but I remember somebody saying at a meeting about circling the wagons. Well, it offended all the First Nations people in the group, because that goes back 150 or 200 years, and it's not appropriate to say those things anymore. But the person didn't even understand where that idiom came from. So we had to do a little education gently, and we addressed it. So it's to make things more welcome, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think the key messages I'd want to leave you folks with would be that we're not here to be perfect, right? You may step into something, or you might, the point is a recognition and an effort, right? A recognition and an effort, um, to try and do the right things. Our world of work is changing. How we have to lead, I think, is changing in some cases, but not. Good principles of leadership would say, pull your people together towards a common goal, right? That's a pretty basic thing. And so, ensuring that everybody is able to do that, in a way that feels good to them, which is fairness, um, is there. We all have biases. I do, right? Everybody does. So it's not an exclusive club. We all have them, but it's recognizing, and it takes time. It takes time. And so that's what I would suggest, is that we are not necessarily here to be perfect, but to have a recognition, and also to be courageous, right?
Yeah.
When something happens, and something to think about, what is your strategy? We may have never thought about it before. Maybe you don't know many people of color, or other communities outside of the ones that where you live, and so on. But what is your strategy? If you see that, will you take that person aside and try to share what that experience could be like? Will you try and use humor? What will you do? Right?
Yeah.
Even just having a strategy around, if I see that on the C Train platform, what am I going to do? Walk away, or I'm going to say something? And of course, there's other situational factors, but just even considering it as something going forward,
Yeah.
um, and that you're on a journey. We're not here to be perfect. Jane Fonda says, we're not here to be perfect, we're here to be whole, right?
Yeah. Interesting. I think so. We're running up against the sort of 45-minute mark, which was the time we asked you to commit to us. I think we're okay to stay. Pauline and I are welcome. I think okay to stay online if you have thoughts or questions. But I would encourage you to take a couple of moments while we're together. And this is big, right? Like a lot of concepts, and we deal with human beings and running organizations. This is probably one of the biggest. And I would encourage you to take a moment and think of this small acronym called PODI, PODI. Pick one and do it. So we covered a lot of ground. So if you're welcome to unmute and say something, or you're welcome to type into the chat box, or you're equally welcome just to sit with us and let it resonate with you and think about it. But if you were to do one thing tomorrow to make it better for people in your organization, or people around you, or your congregation, as the case may be, what's the one simple thing that you could move the or at least move the dial a little bit, not from where we are today to someplace utopic in the future, but just one little thing. So if you want to type it in, or you want to come off mute, feel free to. And if there's nothing, and if you've heard all you like, you're welcome to jump off the call too.